Do you remember when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor? I can recall exactly where I was on that day. I was in grade school, and the principal came on the PA to say America had been attacked. The teacher rolled out the television so we could watch the news. I saw images of American ships sinking in the waters of Hawaii. I saw the news cut to President Clinton telling the nation that he would ask Congress to declare war on the Neo-Empire of Japan. He then did a killer sax solo to rally the country. But wait, you say, none of that happened. And yes, you are right, that didn't happen. But back in the 1990s, some people were convinced it could, and in this video we will discuss why the coming war with Japan never came. Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrich, the alternate historian. In this video we're going to be doing an in-depth review of The Coming War with Japan by George Friedman and Meredith LeBard. But before we get into the book, we need to discuss the historical context that produced said book. The American fear of East Asia, sometimes referred to in American politics as the Yellow Peril, originally manifested with Americans worrying that they'd be overwhelmed by Chinese immigration in the late 19th century. This later morphed into the ultimately real fear about the military ambitions of Japan in the first half of the 20th century. However, Japan's defeat in World War II gave the U.S. a chance to transform their former Pacific rival into a close democratic ally, something America definitely needed when attempting to contain the Soviet Union. The United States thus got to station troops in Japan and guaranteed their security, which in turn helped Japan economically since it could spend much less on national defense than what other nations usually did. In addition, America's policy on free trade among allies helped Japan's economy experience explosive growth in the post-war decades that followed. Soon, Japan became the third largest economy in the world. All in all, it seems that America's democracy building in Japan was a huge success. But perhaps it was too successful. Cracks in the alliance started to form as the Cold War dragged on. The energy crisis of the 1970s led to many Americans switching to more fuel-efficient cars from Japan. People buying Japanese cars, however, meant that they weren't buying American cars, and thus the American automotive industry, especially in places like Detroit, suffered as many Americans lost their jobs. Meanwhile, other Japanese products, like electronics, were also popular in the U.S. To make matters worse, American products just weren't selling in Japan, which led to America having a trade deficit with Japan. Meanwhile, Japanese deregulation of their financial markets, encouraged by the U.S. under President Ronald Reagan, led to many Japanese investors spending money in America. American bonds and real estate were popular targets, but so too were American companies whose owners were more than happy to sell to Japanese buyers. Some Japanese companies even opened factories in the U.S. On top of all this, much of Japan's success was happening at a time when America was experiencing various recessions in the 1980s. Meanwhile, their Cold War rival, the Soviets, were struggling just to stay afloat, and thus did not seem like much of a threat. Indeed, it seemed like a new enemy had emerged from the other side of the Pacific, one that was taking over America not with guns or tanks, but with cold, hard cash. This all contributed to a wave of anti-Japanese sentiment, or Japan bashing as it was referred to, across the United States in the 1980s and early 90s. This became expressed through criticism of Japanese products as being cheap copies of American versions, criticism of Japanese work culture for being too hard on its workers, vandalism against Japanese cars or other products, and racist outbursts and violence against Asian Americans, regardless of their specific ethnicity. An infamous incident included the killing of Vincent Chin, a Chinese American whose attackers thought was Japanese. American politicians cynically attempted to use this xenophobia to their advantage. Democrats in particular found Japan bashing a useful way to attack Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, whose administrations preferred to maintain good relations with Japan. Democrats instead proposed a protectionist trade policy against Japan in an effort to win votes in Michigan and other Rust Belt states, where America's declining manufacturing sector was located. Although, to be fair, even some Republicans got in on the Japan bashing, such as Pat Buchanan and David Duke, a name that is synonymous with, holy crap, that's racist. For Japan's part, they did protest the inherent racism in Japan bashing and the unfairness at being mad at them for doing capitalism better. However, people's ability to sympathize with them was undermined by the fact this was also happening at a time when Japanese nationalism was on the rise. Part of it was pride in their economy, but also some Japanese were beginning to reevaluate their history. Japanese history textbooks started to downplay Japan's actions during World War II, while Japanese leaders publicly honored war dead. Some even went as far as to claim that Japan's success was because it was not a multiracial society. Basically, both nations were being racist in their own unique ways. Meanwhile, Japan bashing began to seep into American pop culture in a variety of ways. Books like Michael Crichton's 1992 novel Rising Sun warned of evil Japanese businessmen seeking to take control of American tech companies. Then there was Tom Clancy's 1994 novel Debt of Honor, which involved Japanese industrialists seizing control of Japan and launching an attack against the United States. And spoiler alert, but this story ends with a Japanese pilot flying a commercial airliner into the US Capitol, killing the president and most of the presidential line of succession. Yikes. Nuclear war novels like Whitley Strieber and James Konutka's 1984 novel War Day and James D. Foreman's 1984 novel Doomsday Plus 12 featured post-World War III scenarios where Japan survives the war and comes to economically dominate parts of the devastated US. Work set in the genre of cyberpunk, which arguably was at its peak during the era of Japan bashing, often featured settings where Japan dominates the world, either culturally, financially, or politically. And alternate history wasn't immune to the influence of Japan bashing either. Alan Steele's 1996 novel, The Tranquility Alternative, featured an America that was declining into vulgar consumerism in the face of the rising powers of Germany and Japan. Films also reflected the belief that Japan was taking over the world. Japanese megacorporations appeared in films like 1988's Die Hard, 1993's RoboCop 3, and the Alien franchise, which features the often villainous Weyland-Yutani Corporation. Meanwhile, in 1989's Back to the Future 2, we see an older version of Marty McFly be fired by his intensely angry Japanese boss. And so this is the state of America when, in 1991, this book is published. It was written by George Friedman and his wife Meredith LeBard, aka Meredith Friedman. George is a professor, writer, and futurologist known for works like the 2009 book The Next 100 Years. He's also the founder of the publishing company Stratfor and the website Geopolitical Futures. George has made a career of attempting to predict the future with various degrees of success, as we shall see. As for Meredith, she has collaborated with her husband on other projects, although how involved she was in this book, I have no idea. In my experience, when people talk about this book, her name rarely gets mentioned compared to her husband's, but who knows, she might actually be the brains behind this operation. Anywho, unlike the fictional works I discussed earlier, this book is supposed to be a serious discussion on how close the US and Japan are to war. Now, they are a savvy Nostradamus couple, so they don't give us a specific date, but they do mention being afraid that their sons will be drafted into a war, and they also shared a map of which Asian and Pacific nations will be allied with either Japan or the United States by the year 2000. I asked Sean McKnight to make a cover of this map, which you are seeing now. So it certainly seems the authors were trying to warn the reader that this war would come in their lifetime. Which of course it didn't. But while this video could just be me pointing out every time they got something wrong, I really want to spend more time explaining why George and Meredith's reasoning for their prediction was always sort of faulty from the very beginning. And to be honest, in order to do this, I had to read a very dry and dense book. Seriously, it was a slog to get through it all. And despite the clickbaity nature of the title, there really weren't a lot of weird or crazy ideas to keep me engaged. Occasionally I would get comments on how the authors didn't have much faith in the European Union and instead thought the former nations of Austria-Hungary would likely reunite again for some reason, but these were only brief moments of entertaining madness. You can even see from my tags where I stopped flagging things and just tried to power through until the very end. I swear to God, the things I do for you people. But basically, the coming war with Japan is an economic history of Japan and how this relates to America. The authors make a big deal of pointing out that Japan's economy is unique in that despite being heavily industrialized, Japan itself lacks natural resources, and the Japanese don't consume what their industries produce. Thus, Japan is heavily dependent not only on imports from other countries, but also on exports to foreign markets. The authors argue this economic necessity is why Japan tried to conquer East Asia during World War II, but after their defeat, they were given an opportunity for economic success by being one of America's chief allies. This not only gave them the ability to import raw materials from American allies, but also gave them access to American consumers, even if it created a trade deficit for the US. But with the Cold War coming to an end, the authors warned the special relationship between Japan and America wouldn't last. George and Meredith argued that America wouldn't need Japan anymore to anchor their defensive line against the Soviets in the Pacific, and so would be less tolerant of a trade deficit with Japan. The US would demand Japan buy more American products and put tariffs on Japanese goods. This would force Japan to look elsewhere to find nations who could give them resources for their industries and markets for their goods. To protect Japan's connection to these markets, Japan would need to build up its military and use it to protect their interest in Asia and elsewhere. If they do, however, this would draw the ire of America and likely kick off a trade war between the two countries that could easily turn hot. So in summary, the same issues that led to war in 1941 have arisen again in 1991. But again, that didn't happen. By the 1990s, Japanese spending in America dried up as the Japanese economy collapsed, which began a decades-long period of economic stagnation. They're known as the Lost Decades. Heck, things got so bad that in an ironic reversal from all those evil Japanese corporate takeover fear-mongering stories I mentioned earlier, some Japanese corporations brought in American execs to help reform their struggling companies. Nevertheless, it suddenly became very hard for Japan to afford a second Pacific War without a fully functioning economy. But the big question is, how did George and Meredith miss this? Occasionally the authors do mention the possibility that Japan's post-war economic miracle might end, but they also seem dreadfully certain that Japan will figure out a way to keep it going no matter the cost. Personally, I think the problem for them is they hyper-focus on the similarities regarding Japan and the United States in the 1930s and 40s versus how the two countries were in the 1980s and 90s. Japan's economy won't collapse because Japan would go to any extreme to prevent that. Thus, in their minds, it's completely rational for Japan to go to war in order to stave off any economic collapse. They are basically arguing that the old phrase, history repeats itself, is less of a truism and more of an actual law of geopolitics. An egregious example of this is how the coming war with Japan treats China. Now, in our present, China is a nation of almost 1.5 billion people, with the world's second largest economy and the world's largest army. The United States and Japan are united in their belief that China and its little buddy North Korea are a threat to each other, and thus still cooperate militarily because of it. But surprisingly, the book does not predict any of this. Indeed, when the authors do talk about China, they state that their poor economy and rising eternal descent may spell the eventual doom of the People's Republic. They even suggest that China would be unable to do anything if Britain decided to renege on their agreement to turn over Hong Kong in 1997. Now, George has been pretty consistent over the years in his belief that China will break up, to the point that even Wikipedia mocks him for it. But what I find interesting is how he justifies it in the coming war with Japan. He points toward what China was like in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is to say a China that was a divided and barely functioning state. The only thing that prevented this from continuing in their eyes was the Cold War, which the authors treat as an aberration or abnormality that stopped the natural, normal flow of history. A history that seems very similar to the age of European imperialism that saw its peak before the World Wars. It's a bizarre and overly deterministic way to view history, made worse by the fact that I don't think the authors know that much about history. Early in the book, the authors bring up the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. While discussing it, they mentioned that Japan was on the verge of seizing all of Siberia, which would have provided the Japanese economy with significant resources, until the United States intervened and forced both sides to agree to the Treaty of Portsmouth. Thus, the authors conclude that because of this intervention, it made the clash between America and Japan inevitable, since Japan had no choice but to seek the resources it needed by conquering the nearby European colonies in East Asia and the Pacific in the 1940s. This is, to be frank, an absurd counterfactual. The authors basically ignore the fact that in spite of the otherwise impressive Japanese victories against the Russians, by the end of the war, Japan's armies were exhausted, their economy was almost bankrupt, and they were not ready for the fresh reinforcements pouring into the Russian Far East, led by commanders ready to go on the offensive. Ultimately, Japan won the war because Russia was so incompetently run that they lacked the political will to keep up the fight. Japan was lucky that not only was Tsar Nicholas II such a terrible leader, but that American President Theodore Roosevelt offered to negotiate a peace. Had the war dragged on another year, the Russians would have likely driven the Japanese off the mainland. Now, I know what you might say. Matt, this isn't that big of a deal. It's just a silly little counterfactual that plenty of authors put in their history books. But here's the thing. Both George and Meredith claim in the book and elsewhere that they are pretty knowledgeable about Japan. Indeed, they need to be experts for them to make the serious claim that a shooting war between America and Japan is on the horizon. So why then would these so-called experts know so little about this significant event in Japanese history? It really highlights how shallow the author's understanding of history really is. And if your thesis is that history is about to repeat itself, how can anyone who actually knows the history believe you? What's worse is this argument completely removes human choice from the equation, and while this might be my most vibes-based argument I make in this video, I don't think Americans or the Japanese wanted a war in the 1990s. The thing about Japan bashing is that even at its height, most Americans still had a positive attitude toward Japan. Indeed, all of this Japan bashing coincided with a growing appreciation for Japanese culture in America. Examples include the explosion in popularity of Japanese video games and anime. Figures from Japanese history and legends like ninjas and samurai were common in American pop culture. Sushi and hibachi places can be found all across America. Heck, would Star Wars get made if George Lucas didn't watch the 1958 Japanese film The Hidden Fortress? And this cultural exchange works both ways. American food, fashion, and music have all found fans in Japan. Baseball, Japan's most popular sport, was introduced to them by Americans. And while some Americans might have found the idea of the Japanese buying up so many American businesses and property to be scary, for many others it was welcomed. Struggling American communities benefited from Japanese investment in local businesses. Many American companies also attempted to emulate Japanese business practices. And while the Japan bashing did get headlines, it didn't always materialize into votes for those politicians. Indeed, Democrats dropped it pretty quickly after Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992. Although by then the damage was done, and it probably drove many Asian Americans into the Republican camp, since they were the party at the time who were the least likely to do any Japan bashing. Lesson for Democrats: maybe don't throw an entire group of Americans under the bus in an effort to gain the bigot vote. I guess my larger point is that war between America and Japan is partly unlikely because their respective peoples don't want one. A Pew Research Center survey showed that by 2015, most Americans and Japanese had a positive view of the other, and didn't view the Japan bashing in the 1980s and 90s as being all that significant to their relationship. And hey, America and Britain fought 2 wars, and yet have been at peace for 200 plus years. So is it really that implausible to believe that Japan and America, 2 nations that have been allies for almost 80 years now, can't do the same? Unfortunately, at the time of writing this script, America is involved in a trade war with Japan due to President Donald Trump's concern over the trade deficit, which he thinks he can correct through tariffs. Surprisingly, the man's obsession with tariffs may benefit Japan in comparison to other countries if this chart can be believed. But with increasing doubts regarding Japan's alliance with the US and Japan being pressured to beef up its military, will the predictions in the coming war with Japan turn out to be right in the end? No. The predictions in the coming war with Japan didn't come true, and are likely to come true, because the very foundation for them is flawed. It suggests an incredibly deterministic path for billions of people that is based on a shallow understanding of history and requires the complete removal of human choice. It is not only poorly written, I suspect it was pushed out in a cynical attempt to cash in on the irrational and xenophobic fears sweeping America at the time, much like how Republican politicians in our present are whipping up a campaign of hate against immigrants. Thus, I can't recommend this book, not even for the cheap laughs, but I hope if there are any budding futurologists out there watching this video, they might use the coming war with Japan as a cautionary tale on how not to predict the future. Well, that's all I have to say on this subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, share this video, or support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.